I'll bring you in here, Mr. Roets, because as AfriForum, you have positioned yourself as the guys who are opposing these BEE deals, BEE decisions. Are you responsible for the bullying? Are you bullying us to cave in? Are you winning?
Thank you, Dr. V, for this evening, and it's been. I've had a great time since walking in this hotel room. So thank you very much for being so cordial, and we've had a great discussion before. And in fact, I prepared a very provocative statement on why we are critical about BEE, but after being accepted so friendly, I feel like I have to, I feel like I have to rewrite my statement to just say I agree with what Mr. Manyi is saying, but the reason why I can't do that is because then we would both be wrong. So for the interest of a frank and brutally honest discussion, I'm going to stick to my statement, which is a criticism of the very principle of BEE, and hopefully that will provide some input into this discussion. They say if you give a man a fish, you can feed him for an evening, but if you teach a man to fish, you will feed him for a lifetime, or he can feed himself for a lifetime. But if you give him someone else's fish, then he will vote for you. Now,
okay.
Black economic empowerment is, and that's what I'm going to be arguing, is the notion Black economic empowerment is a semantic fraud, because it has nothing to do with empowerment, and it has actually very little to do with Black people. It is a policy that I will argue is destructive and also immoral. It is destructive because the focus is not on production. The focus is not on growing the proverbial pie that is the economy. It's not on growing the economy. It's simply on redistribution of opportunities within the economy, and particularly on a racial basis. Affirmative action, which of course is you could describe as the policy framework that underlies BEE, is developed or aimed at creating government dependency, to be brutally honest. It renders people, but particularly Black people, dependent on government for success. And that's the opposite of empowerment. BEE benefits also only the politically connected in practice at the expense of the rest of the country, regardless of their race. The assumptions on which BEE is predicated are the same assumptions which have created the world's worst economies. These assumptions are also an attack on the economic ideas which have led to the world's highest employment rates in other countries. Or put differently, the economic ideas worshipped by the ruling elite are those which have led to the most catastrophic economic collapses of the past century, while the economic ideas despised by the ruling elite are those which have led to the greatest economic success stories of the past century. BEE is also immoral because it construes both white prosperity and Black poverty as the result of the same unquestionable phenomenon, which is theft by whites. It can only be morally sustained if we accept the false assumption that you can only be poor if you have been oppressed, or you can only be wealthy if you have oppressed someone. It can also only be morally sustained if it purports that all Black people are poor and that all white people are rich. Or in other words, that rich Black people don't exist and poor white people don't exist. If it concedes this, if it concedes that rich Black people exist and poor white people exist, it has to concede that it is simply a racist policy. Why? Because it enriches Black people who are already rich even more, and it ignores impoverished white people. Furthermore, it declares impoverished white people as advantaged, while it declares Black billionaires to be disadvantaged. It argues that the property and the opportunities that belong to person A should be taken from this person and given to person B, because the property and opportunities that belonged to person Y was taken from that person and given to person Z, even if it happened half a century ago. It is generally characterized by a spectacular failure and by unprecedented corruption. BEE is not about empowering Black people. It's about empowering the friends of the ANC. And the race merchants who pursue this policy are driven much more apparently by their envy and their hatred for the haves than by their compassion for the have-nots. They are more angry about the low percentage of white unemployment than they are concerned about the high percentage of black unemployment, evidently. We all know that black empowerment does not lead to job creation. We've seen it, and we're discussing that tonight. But the immoral race merchant do not seem to care. Black economic empowerment is morally bankrupt, and it's to the disadvantage of everyone in this country, except for the wallets of the politically connected and the feelings of the ideologically intoxicated. Thank you.
That is like, it's like a dagger straight into your heart. Okay, just to remind everyone, Mr. Roets.
Thank you. Perhaps a way to start is to say that I honestly mean it when I say that I despise the idea of paternalism. And this is the position of our organization as well, the idea that one community should decide on behalf of someone else's, of another community, what is in their interest. I think we've had enough of that, and I think we've learned through experience that doesn't work. So in a sense, we, as a minority community, we sort of get the message that a lot of people in this country, and particularly in the ruling elite, don't regard us as welcome. We get that message. And so I can tell you what we are going to do, what we as a community are doing, and what we are going to do increasingly, the more we feel alienated, the more we become alienated from this country and from this government or this ruling elite. But what I can do, without trying to be paternalistic, I can comment on the failure of BEE and give some advice which I would regard as advice, which of course you can decide if you want to take it or not. But the most important thing is that we must be empirical as opposed to ideological. And when I say we must be empirical, is we must learn from experience. And there are 200 case studies that we can learn from, because there are about 200 countries in the world, depending on how many countries are recognized and so forth. So what we should be doing is to look for countries where people were poor and there was some form of a policy or an intervention and people became wealthy as a result, or after that, or what has been done, where are the examples of poor communities that became wealthy? That's the one empirical study that we should do. And the other one is, what are the examples of wealthy countries that became poor, or poor countries, maybe more importantly, poor countries that tried something and it worsened things. And the problem is that the whole discussion about BEE, this type of policy debates have been tried, and these policy ideas, and all of the cases where it has been tried has resulted in more poverty. And when I'm talking about more government regulation, getting government more involved in the economy, in other words, the more government is involved, the less free the market is. This is what has been tried in different ways in Zimbabwe and Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, we can go down the list. So what we should be doing is look at what were the policies that led to actual success stories, and what the basic premise of BEE is, which is more government control. There's no example in history where that has led to a success story. China is not an example, because China became wealthier as a result of the special economic zones. Sweden and Denmark are not examples. They have much government control now, but they didn't become wealthy as a result of government control. They became wealthy as a result of property rights and free markets. And the evidence also says that clearly this policy isn't working, because unemployment is increasing. It has been increasing since 1994. So what we have now is a semi-aggressive policy that has led to a semi-aggressive failure. And if we say, well, now we need to implement the same policy just more aggressively, there's no evidence that it's not going to lead to a more aggressive failure. And I think that's something that we should be cautious of. Just on a comment of the point about fixing inequality, and maybe I'm wrong, but the study I looked at was a study done by, you can look it up and maybe he's wrong, but an economic historian called Walter Scheidel. He wrote a book about his study. It's called The Great Leveler. And he asked the question, what can a government do to fix the problem of inequality? And he looked at, I think, 200 years of history. And his conclusion was, there's virtually nothing. you can fix the problem of poverty, and you can fix the problem of unemployment. But his conclusion was that there are only 4 ways that you can fix inequality, and they are mass mobilization warfare. In other words, 4 ways in which you can make people financially equal. Mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolutions, in other words, violent revolutions, state collapse, and then catastrophic plagues. Now you might say, oh, revolution sounds like a good one. But then his conclusion is, it's only temporary. Even if you do these things, it's only temporary, and then inequality starts again. So the world has not been able to solve the problem of inequality, but the world has been able to solve the problem of unemployment. And I think that's something that we can learn lessons from. And maybe just the last comment is it seems to me that the BEE policy is like the story of a man or a person who builds a house, or he buys a house, let's say a 3-bedroom house, and then he discovers, which is now the policy of BEE. And he discovers this house isn't really what I wanted it to be. And so what this house actually needs is another room over here. And then you build this new room. In other words, you make a new law. And then, well, this isn't really, something is still not right. So we need maybe to enlarge the living room. Maybe we need a new bathroom. Maybe we need to do this. And then at the end of the day, after 10 years, someone walks into the house and says, well, this house doesn't make sense. Just from a planning perspective, it doesn't make sense. And I think what we ought to be doing is maybe to step back and say, maybe the house isn't built in the correct place in the first place. And what I mean by that is if the house that is BEE is built on the idea that government must intervene more aggressively, the house, in my opinion, isn't built in the correct place. The house should be built, firstly, if the point is Black empowerment, the most important thing is fixing the education system. And then the second most important thing is, or maybe equally important, is making it easier for people to start companies and to start businesses and to employ people. But the more we regulate the economy, the more difficult it becomes to start companies, and the more difficult it becomes to employ people, and the more we have unemployment. I think maybe I'll conclude with that. I think that's a very important thing that we need to at least consider before we throw the idea in the dustbin.
Okay, but you see, the biggest problem with your argument is that most of your argument doesn't seem to be based on facts. I think you're pushing more an ideological thing.
Thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much for inviting me and welcoming us to this event. Maybe just a few closing comments from my side. There's in the Afrikaner culture, there's a very important person in our culture, in Afrikaner culture, who isn't that well known. His name was Father Kestel. He was a religious leader who lived during the time of the Anglo-Boer War. And he had this slogan, he popularized this slogan within the Afrikaner community, which was, "A volk red homself," which means a people saves itself. And that was, I don't want to talk too long, but we know the reference of the Anglo-Boer War was mentioned, and the scorched earth policy, and the houses and the farms that were burned down, and 30,000 people died in the concentration camp, not even counting the Black people, who are the same amount, who died in the concentration camps as well. So the Afrikaner community was destroyed at that time. And then in 1914, which I think is an important part about Afrikaner history, it's not that well known, was the time of the rebellion, the Afrikaner rebellion. So what happened there is that was when the First World War broke out, and South Africa was a union. It was governed by the British, and the Afrikaners thought, now is our opportunity to take back the country. So they took up arms against the government, and they failed. And a lot of them were killed, and some were, one important well-known person was executed. And what happened then is they were then fined millions of pounds. So they were then even more poorer than they were after the Anglo-Boer War. And that's at this time when Father Kestel, this religious leader, said, "A volk red homself," a people saves itself. And that's the story of how many of these, where the money came from, at least. I'm not saying these University of Pretoria and University of Potchefstroom and all of these were built by white people, but the money came from somewhere. And the money came from widows and women whose children were killed during the war, who baked koeksisters and melktart, and who went into the streets to blikskit, as we call it, to beg in the streets for money. And they collected cents through entrepreneurship from a very, very small scale. And that's how they built, at least where the money came from. And the same story with the Soltech campus. I don't know if you saw the story in the news that was built by the Solidarity Movement this year. It was inaugurated. It cost 300 million rand to build. the campus, the university, the single biggest donation for that campus was 10 Rand. It's people on a small scale contributing, saying, listen, we need to build something. So even if you only give 10 Rand, if you can organize it in that way, you can build something that's big. Now imagine if we've spent all the time that we've spent since 1994, that we've spent on having discussions about being excluded, and this government policy has to change, and those white people are oppressing us. Imagine if all that time has been spent on having seminars about entrepreneurship and developing companies. And now, yes, there are barriers, but other communities have also had barriers to build companies. I think we are missing an opportunity. And there was a comment by one of the questions who said, and I wrote it down, it says that we need government policy or government regulation because people don't do things for you out of their own will. Now that's probably correct. At least few people, very small percentage of people actually do something for someone else. They say, oh, here's my money, you can take it. But I don't know, maybe I have, and I might sound like I'm facetious, but maybe I have more faith in my Black African counterparts than I think some of the people here, because I don't think you need to wait for someone to give you something to achieve something. Not one of the wealthiest person in the history of the world was a Black person, was Mansa Musa. When he traveled to Egypt towards Mecca, the story is that he literally traveled with camels full of gold. And as he was traveling through Cairo, he just handed out gold to everybody. He handed out so much gold that the economy of Egypt collapsed after he left the country. And it didn't make a dent in his wealth. And now one of the comments or the questions was, yes, but you AfriForum, we know what you're doing. You just don't want to be regulated. Well, number one, yes, we don't want to be regulated. Number two, that's not the point. The point is that we need to look at success stories. We can say, you don't want to be regulated, we're going to regulate you. And the fact that you don't want to be regulated, that just means we need to regulate you. The point is, where are the success stories that this type of policy is working? And some were mentioned. East Germany was mentioned. East Germany became wealthy because it was liberated from socialism, because the Berlin Wall fell. East Germany was socialist, and West Germany was, you could call it capitalist. Now, I'm not arguing for capitalism because I don't think capitalism is the answer, believe it or not. But East Germany was liberated from socialism. That's why East Germany became a success. Singapore became the wealthiest country on earth, if not, or one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, because of free market policies, because of deregulation, not because of more regulation. China, well, I think that's probably the most alarming thing to my mind that was said tonight was China addressed the ethnic problem. If we look at what China is doing with what's happening in China with ethnic minorities, I don't think we should say China is fixing the ethnic problem. I think it's very alarming. And Malaysia is probably the best example. It's probably the most important example because the way I understand, and maybe Mr. Mani can correct me, that the South African affirmative action policy or BEE policy was largely or mostly based on the Malaysian model. And the drafters of the Malaysian affirmative action policy came afterwards and said several decades after the policy isn't working, according to their calculations, only 5% of the people who should have benefited from the policy actually benefited. And what they said, what's happening in Malaysia, is the only people who are benefiting from this is the politically connected, people who are friends with government or friends with high-profile politicians. Those are the people benefiting from affirmative action in Malaysia. And Malaysia was characterized by poor service delivery and the same things that's happening in South Africa. And then I'm concluding. Two last comments. The one interesting thing for me, or very interesting thing, is that white people in South Africa actually became wealthier in the last few decades. You can say under BEE and under affirmative action, white people became wealthier. And now we're trying to explain why did that happen. I think the most important contributing factor to the fact that white people became wealthier is, firstly, they were dependent on government during the previous regime. And there was this very serious break when white people discovered, well, we're not dependent on government anymore. We are being discriminated against by racial policies, of which there are, by a recent analysis, more than 80 race-based laws in South Africa that were accepted after 1994. So white people were forced out of government dependency and forced into starting their own businesses and taking care of themselves. They were forced into this volkretom self notion of Father Kestel. And then suddenly, they didn't expect it, but suddenly they found that they were becoming wealthier than they were when they worked for the government. And then lastly, I honestly think I'm not too pessimistic about the future for my community, for Afrikaners. I honestly believe that Afrikaners as a cultural community are going to survive. I think Afrikaners are going to thrive in South Africa. I think there are very serious challenges that our community is experiencing that might not be the same than what other communities are experiencing. But you don't thrive, and you don't. And I think I hope we can all agree that wealth is not the only measure of prosperity or happiness. That there are other things also that are important. But you don't thrive, and you don't become more free, and you don't become more successful by endlessly debating about government policies and arguing for more government policies and saying that we need to change this policy to do that. You can do that, but no one has ever won that game. I don't know of any person who has said, even Hendrik Verwoerd at one stage, well, towards the end of his life, he said, no, we're not winning this policy game. We need more policies and it's not working. And I mean, we all know what happened there, how that went. The point is, the only way you can thrive is to roll up your sleeves and to convert 10 cents into 20 cents and 20 cents into 1 rand and 1 rand into 10 rand, and making starting businesses, even if there are very difficult circumstances, and just developing that into something. That's the only way. It's the only sustainable way. And that's what my community is trying to do, and we're not always succeeding. But I really hope that it's not something that we invented. It's a lesson we learned from other people. And I really hope that more people can learn that lesson. Thank you.
Thank you so much.